She arrived at his door like a fragile bird blown in by the desert wind, dust-covered and desperate, offering labor for a single meal. The Alpha Apache, feared by settlers and respected by warriors, had built walls around his heart as solid as the mountains themselves. Yet when their eyes met, something ancient stirred within him. He motioned her inside against all reason, against the whispers of his men. Her hands trembled as she took the offered bread, unaware she'd crossed an invisible boundary no one had breached in years. As days turned to weeks, the orphan girl's presence began changing the ranch in ways no one expected. Could a man who'd lost everything to betrayal risk trusting again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The vastness of Blackwater Ranch stretched toward the horizon like a sleeping giant. 15,000 acres of land that Dakota had built with calloused hands and iron determination. The main house stood proud against the merciless sun, its timber walls darkened by years of weather and watchfulness. Clara woke to unfamiliar softness beneath her. The straw mattress felt like clouds compared to the hard ground she'd known for months. Sunlight filtered through worn curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. For a moment, she forgot where she was, panic rising in her throat. "Breakfast!" came a gruff voice from beyond the door. Not Dakota's, one of his men. She hurried to make herself presentable, fingers combing through tangled hair. The mirror on the wall revealed a girl she barely recognized. Hollowed cheeks, but eyes that held a spark, not yet extinguished by hardship. The kitchen buzzed with morning activity. 5 men sat at a long table, their conversation dying as she entered. The cook, an older Mexican man with a face like carved leather, glanced at her without expression. "Sit," he said, pointing to an empty stool at the far end. Clara obeyed, keeping her eyes lowered. A bowl of porridge appeared before her, steam rising with the promise of sustenance. She fought the urge to devour it like an animal. "The girl has manners," observed a tall ranch hand with a thick mustache. "Thought you'd be eaten with your fingers," Miguel warned the cook. "Enough," Miguel shrugged, returning to his breakfast. "Just surprised is all. Dakota ain't never let strays stay before." The cook placed a tin cup of coffee near her bowl. "I'm Ernesto. Been cooking for Blackwater 15 years. His eyes studied her with curiosity rather than the suspicion she saw in the others. "You know how to work in a kitchen?" Clara nodded, swallowing a mouthful of porridge. "I've worked in taverns. Gleaned, served. Good, you'll help me today." The door swung open and conversation ceased entirely. Dakota entered, filling the doorframe with his presence. In daylight, Clara could better see the man who had offered her shelter. Tall and broad-shouldered, his black hair tied back with a leather cord, face weathered by sun and hardship. The Apache blood was evident in his high cheekbones and obsidian eyes that missed nothing. He moved to the head of the table without acknowledging anyone, least of all Clara. Ernesto placed a plate before him without being asked. "North fence needs mending," Dakota said between bites. "Take Samuel and Diego." "Yes, boss," replied Miguel. "What about the cattle in the east pasture?" "They're getting mighty thirsty with that creek drying up. Move them to the lower field." Dakota's voice carried the weight of command without raising its volume. Clara ate silently, aware of his presence like a physical force. Only when the men began to leave did Dakota's gaze finally rest upon her. She met it steadily, refusing to cower despite the flutter in her stomach. "Ernesto will show you your duties," he said. "Do as he says." With that, he rose and left, but not before retrieving something from a shelf, a brass spyglass, its casing dented and worn. Clara would later learn this was his daily ritual, surveying his domain from the highest point on the property. Ernesto handed her an apron. "First we clean, then prepare for midday meal." The kitchen became her world that morning. She scrubbed pots until her fingers ached, peeled vegetables, and learned where everything belonged. Ernesto was strict but patient, correcting without cruelty when she made mistakes. Through the open window, Clara watched the ranch hands at work, men moving with purpose across the drought-hardened land. And occasionally, on the distant ridge, she glimpsed Dakota's silhouette, spyglass in hand, watching over it all. Why do they call him the Alpha Apache? She asked Ernesto as they kneaded dough for bread, the cook's hands stilled momentarily. Because he is Alpha, the leader, both by blood and by earning it. His father was a great chief before the wars. Dakota walks in two worlds, respected in both. He lowered his voice. The townspeople, they fear what they don't understand, but they respect what he has built here. And his family? Ernesto shook his head. That is his story to tell if he chooses. By afternoon, when the men returned dust-covered and hungry, Clara had earned at least Ernesto's grudging approval. She served the meal without spilling anything, refilled water cups without being asked, and cleaned efficiently alongside the cook. As the sun began its descent, Dakota returned to the kitchen. He placed the spyglass on a high shelf, one lens cracked but still functional. The girl is working out, he asked Ernesto, as though Clara weren't present. She works hard, the cook replied. Doesn't complain. Dakota nodded once, then turned to leave. At the doorway he paused. There are extra blankets in the storage room. Nights get cold. It was the closest thing to kindness she had received in months. Clara watched him go, this enigmatic man, who had allowed her to stay when others would have turned her away. The ranch hands spoke of him with respect tinged with fear, but Clara saw something else in the careful way he handled the broken spyglass, a man who valued damaged things that still had purpose. That night, wrapped in the promised extra blankets, Clara fell asleep to the unfamiliar sound of safety, men's voices on night watch, the creak of the solid wooden house, and the distant howl of coyotes that remained outside, where threats belonged. Clara woke before dawn, her body remembering old habits. In the orphanage, those who rose first got warm water. On the streets, early risers found the best scraps. She dressed quickly, fingers brushing against the small red ribbon tucked in her pocket, faded and frayed, but the color still visible in good light. A flash of memory, gentle hands tying it in her hair, the scent of lavender. The kitchen was dark when she entered. Clara found matches, lit a lamp, and set to work. By the time Ernesto arrived, the fire was crackling in the stove, water was heating, and Clara was scrubbing potatoes. The cook stopped short, suspicion narrowing his eyes. "What are you doing?" "Working," Clara replied simply. "Early start means more gets done." Ernesto studied her, then nodded once. "Start the coffee. Men will be up soon." When the ranch hands filed in, surprise registered on their faces at the sight of Clara already serving. Miguel raised his eyebrows but said nothing. The others followed his lead, accepting coffee with murmured thanks. Dakota entered last, pausing briefly at the sight of Clara working efficiently alongside Ernesto. Their eyes met across the room. Clara didn't look away, her chin lifting slightly. Something shifted in his expression, not quite approval, but acknowledgement. "The cattle need moving today," he announced to the men. "Drought's getting worse. Eastern pasture won't last another week. We're short-handed for a full drive," Miguel pointed out. "Since Jeb left," Dakota's gaze returned to Clara. "Can you ride?" The question surprised everyone, especially Clara. "Yes," she answered, though it had been years since she'd been on a horse. "My father taught me when I was small." The men exchanged glances. It was the first personal detail she'd revealed. "You'll help with the supplies," Dakota decided. Ernesto, prepare food for the day. An hour later, Clara found herself atop an older mare, gentler than the others. Her skirt hiked scandalously high. She'd fashioned a makeshift split for riding. The red ribbon, normally hidden in her pocket, now secured her hair back from her face, a small gesture of determination. The day proved brutal. The sun beat down mercilessly as they moved cattle from one pasture to another. Clara's job was simple but exhausting, delivering water, helping Ernesto with the midday meal, keeping track of strays spotted from the perimeter. By afternoon, her hands were blistered, her face sunburnt despite the borrowed hat. Every muscle screamed in protest, but she refused to complain. When her mare stumbled on the uneven ground, Clara nearly fell, but righted herself quickly. "Girl's tougher than she looks," she overheard Diego tell Miguel. "Thought she'd be crying by now. $5 says she won't last the week," Miguel wagered. Clara pretended not to hear, focusing instead on the task at hand. But the doubt fueled her resolve. She'd survived worse than blisters and sunburn. She'd survived hunger that hollowed her from the inside out, cold that turned her fingers blue, and men whose intentions made her flee in the night. When one of the young calves strayed toward dangerous ground, Clara reacted without thinking. She guided her mare forward, cutting off the calf's path and herding it back toward safety. The maneuver wasn't graceful, but it was effective. From his position on higher ground, Dakota watched. Clara felt his eyes on her but didn't look up. She had something to prove, not just to him or his men, but to herself. As the sun began to set, they returned to the ranch. Clara's legs nearly buckled when she dismounted. She steadied herself against the fence, willing strength back into her limbs before anyone noticed. "Girl." She turned to find Dakota behind her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "You did well today." 3 words, yet they washed over her like cool water. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. "Your hands need tending," he observed. "See Ernesto. He has salve." Clara looked down at her palms, raw and beginning to bleed in places. She'd been so focused on not showing weakness that she'd barely noticed the pain. "Thank you," she managed, "for letting me help." Something changed in his eyes then, a softening so brief she might have imagined it. "Rest tonight. Tomorrow will be harder." As he walked away, Clara touched the ribbon in her hair, now dusty and even more faded from the day's sun. She couldn't remember her mother's face anymore, but sometimes, like now, she felt her strength flowing through that simple strip of cloth. In the kitchen, Ernesto clucked over her hands but said nothing as he applied a pungent salve. The older man's gentleness surprised her. "He doesn't let people stay," Ernesto said finally, wrapping a clean cloth around her worst blisters. "Not in the house. Not ever." "Then why?" Clara began. "That," Ernesto interrupted, "is what we all wonder." He corked the salve bottle. "Eat, then sleep. Like he said, tomorrow will be harder." That night, Clara removed the ribbon from her hair, carefully folded it and returned it to her pocket. Its presence against her hip was comforting as she drifted into exhausted sleep, dreaming of open pastures and dark eyes that saw more than they revealed. The wagon creaked beneath them as Dakota guided the team of horses toward town. Clara sat stiffly beside him, conscious of the distance he maintained even on the narrow bench. After a week at Blackwater Ranch, this was her first visit to redemption. "They won't welcome me," Dakota stated matter-of-factly, eyes fixed on the dusty road ahead. "They tolerate me because they need what I provide." "Remember that," Clara nodded, understanding the warning beneath his words. Her hands, still tender but healing, gripped the worn leather of her seat as the town appeared on the horizon. Redemption consisted of one main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a saloon, general store, small hotel, and church, standing out among the scattered structures. People paused in their activities as Dakota's wagon rolled in, conversations halting mid-sentence. "The Apache brings his new pet," someone muttered. Loud enough to carry, Clara's back stiffened, but Dakota's expression remained impassive as he guided the wagon to the general store. He jumped down, then extended a hand to help Clara. His touch was brief but steady. "Stay close," he instructed, his voice low. The store owner's smile tightened when they entered. "Mr. Blackwater," he greeted Dakota, using the name of the ranch rather than his given name. His eyes flicked to Clara with undisguised curiosity. "And company." "Supplies," Dakota replied, handing over a list. While the storekeeper gathered their order, Clara wandered toward the fabric section. Her dress, mended repeatedly, wouldn't survive many more weeks of ranch work. Her fingers traced inexpensive calico, calculating what she could afford after a few more days' wages. "That shade would suit you." Clara turned to find an older woman studying her. Unlike the others, her smile seemed genuine. "I'm Martha Wilson, the schoolteacher," she introduced herself. "You're staying at Blackwater Ranch?" Clara nodded cautiously. I work there. Brave girl, Martha remarked. Not many would take that position. She lowered her voice. Is he treating you properly? The question carried implications that made Clara's cheeks warm. Mr. Blackwater is a fair employer, she replied stiffly. Martha seemed about to say more when the door swung open. A man wearing a tarnished sheriff's badge entered, his gaze immediately finding Dakota. Tension radiated through the store. Blackwater, the sheriff acknowledged, deliberately leaving off any respectful title. Heard there was trouble at the Henderson place. Cattle missing. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? The accusation hung in the air. Clara watched Dakota's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. My cattle are branded, he replied evenly. Anyone who can read knows which are mine. The sheriff's badge caught the light as he shifted, revealing its worn and neglected state, much like his application of justice. Clara would soon learn. Just passing along concerns, Sheriff Caldwell said with a shrug that suggested otherwise. His eyes shifted to Clara. This the girl folks been talking about? Bit young, ain't she, even for you? Clara felt heat rise to her face, this time from anger rather than embarrassment. Before Dakota could respond, she stepped forward. I'm of age, Sheriff, she stated clearly, and employed fairly as kitchen help and ranch hand. Your concern is unnecessary. Surprise flickered across the sheriff's face, followed by amusement. Got a tongue on her, this one. Our business is concluded, Dakota said, placing coins on the counter for their supplies. Clara, she followed him outside, feeling the weight of stares as they loaded the wagon. The tension in Dakota's shoulders told her more than words could about how these interactions affected him. As they prepared to leave, a well-dressed man approached from the direction of the bank. His expensive suit and gold watch chain marked him as someone of importance, but it was the coldness in his eyes that caught Clara's attention. Dakota Blackwater, the man called. I was hoping to run into you. Dakota's expression hardened. Thornton, Silas Thornton smiled without warmth. I've made another offer to the bank for that northern section of your property. The one with the year-round spring. His gaze shifted to Clara, assessing her with unsettling intensity. Interesting. You've found new help. My land isn't for sale, Dakota replied. Not to you, not to anyone. Everything has a price, Thornton countered. Even loyalty. His eyes lingered on Clara. Good day, miss. Clara remained silent, sensing the danger beneath his polite inquiry. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, until they were well beyond town limits. Only then did Dakota speak. Thornton wants my water rights. The drought makes them valuable. Clara understood this was his way of explaining what she had witnessed. The sheriff works for him? A humorless smile touched Dakota's lips. Most of the town does in one way or another. Not everyone, Clara observed, thinking of Martha's kindness. Dakota glanced at her, something like respect in his gaze. No, he agreed. Not everyone. That night, Clara helped Ernesto prepare supper, her mind replaying the day's events. She understood better now why Dakota kept to himself, why the ranch operated as its own isolated world. The tarnished badge of supposed justice offered no protection to men like him or girls like her. 2 weeks had transformed Clara. Her hands had hardened. Her skin had darkened under the relentless sun, and her thin frame had begun to fill out with regular meals. The kitchen was her domain in the mornings and evenings, while afternoons found her helping with whatever ranch work suited her growing skills. Tonight, she sat on the porch steps, mending a tear in her work skirt by the light of a kerosene lamp. The evening air carried the scent of sage and distant rain that never seemed to reach Blackwater Ranch. From this vantage point, she could see Dakota at the corral, working with a young stallion that had resisted breaking. His movements were patient, almost gentle, so different from the rough handling she'd witnessed from other men. The stallion's resistance gradually lessened as Dakota spoke to it in his native tongue. Words Clara couldn't understand but recognized as soothing. When he finally mounted the horse, man and animal moved as one, circling the corral in the fading light. Clara's needle stilled as she watched. There was something mesmerizing about his communion with the animal, a wordless understanding. As Takoda dismounted and secured the corral gate, his hand moved to his chest, briefly touching something beneath his shirt. Clara had noticed this gesture before, a talisman of some kind that he kept close. Later, as she helped Ernesto clean the kitchen, she asked about it. "What does Takoda wear around his neck? I've seen him touch it after working with the horses." Ernesto's hands slowed in their work. "Eagle feather, given to him by his father when he completed his warrior training. Very sacred. He still follows the old ways?" "He walks two paths," Ernesto replied. "Respects both. The eagle feather reminds him of who he is." The next morning brought the first real argument between ranch hands that Clara had witnessed. Miguel and Diego stood toe-to-toe near the stables, voices raised about missing tools. "You always blame me," Diego shouted. "Maybe you're the one who can't keep track of your own equipment." Miguel's face darkened with anger. "Are you calling me a liar?" Clara, crossing the yard with a basket of clean laundry, slowed her steps. The tension crackled like lightning before a storm. "Enough." Takoda's voice cut through their argument. He appeared from the stables, his expression stern. Both men fell silent immediately. "We don't have time for this," he said quietly. "The north pasture fence won't fix itself." As the men dispersed, Takoda's gaze met Clara's across the yard. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement of her presence in this masculine world. He adjusted his shirt collar, and Clara glimpsed the leather cord around his neck. That evening, Clara found herself alone by the fire pit behind the house. The ranch hands had gone to bed early, exhausted from a long day's work. She stared into the flames, lost in thought. "You're settling in?" She startled at Takoda's voice. He stood a few feet away, his features softened by firelight. "Yes," she answered simply, making room on the log where she sat. To her surprise, he accepted the invitation, lowering himself beside her with a graceful economy of movement. For several minutes they sat in companionable silence, watching the flames dance. "Why did you let me stay?" Clara finally asked, the question that had lingered since her arrival. Takoda remained silent so long that she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was thoughtful. "Your eyes," he said finally. They weren't defeated. Clara turned to look at him, finding him already watching her. "I've seen that look before," he continued. "In the mirror." The confession, so simply stated, opened a door between them. Clara nodded, understanding more than he'd put into words. "My parents died when I was 8, she offered in return. Fever took them both within days of each other. "The orphanage?" "Until I was 16. Then they said I was old enough to make my own way." Her mouth twisted. "That way led nowhere good, until I heard about work in these parts." Takoda nodded, his hand unconsciously moving to the cord at his neck. This time he withdrew the object that hung from it, a single eagle feather. Its edges softened with age, but its significance undiminished. "My father gave me this when I was 17, he said, allowing her to see but not touch the sacred object. "He told me an eagle sees clearly from great heights, sees the whole picture." His eyes met hers. "Sometimes we're too close to our own struggles to see the path forward." Clara understood he was sharing something precious, not just the physical object, but the wisdom it represented. "The men respect you," she observed. "Even when they disagree with each other, they listen to you." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Respect is earned, not demanded." The fire crackled between them, sending sparks upward like earthbound stars seeking to return home. "Thank you," Clara said softly, "for the chance to earn my place here." Takoda tucked the feather back beneath his shirt. "You already have." When he rose to leave, the absence of his presence beside her felt tangible. Clara remained by the fire until the flames died down to embers, reflecting on how dramatically her life had changed in such a short time. From starving orphan to a young woman with purpose, and perhaps, if she dared to hope, somewhere she belonged. Miguel burst through the kitchen door, breathless and dusty. Cattle missing from the north pasture. "Got fence." Takoda rose immediately from the breakfast table, his coffee forgotten. "How many?" "At least 15 head, maybe more. Diego's still counting. The ranch hands moved with practiced efficiency, gathering weapons and saddling horses. Clara watched from the doorway, sensing the gravity of the situation. Cattle theft was more than just a crime. It was a direct challenge. "I need you here," Dakota told her, buckling on his gun belt. "If we're not back by nightfall, get Ernesto and bar the doors." Clara nodded, understanding what wasn't said. Raiders bold enough to steal cattle might return for more. As the men mounted up, Clara noticed Dakota checking a rifle that looked different from the others, older, with intricate carvings on the wooden stock. "My father's," he explained, seeing her interest. "Never failed me." Then they were gone, dust rising behind them as they rode toward the north pasture. Clara returned to the kitchen, helping Ernesto prepare food that could be carried and eaten cold. Her mind, however, remained with the riders. "This has happened before?" she asked. Ernesto nodded grimly. "3 times this year, more than coincidence." "Thornton," the cook shrugged. "No proof. But cattle taken always have Dakotas. Brand." He showed her the branding iron that hung near the back door, a distinctive mark combining a traditional Apache symbol with the letters BW for Blackwater. He designed it himself, Ernesto explained. "Like him, part of both worlds, belonging fully to neither." Hours passed with no word. Clara tried to keep busy, but anxiety gnawed at her. By mid-afternoon, she found herself climbing to the ranch house roof, using Dakota's broken spyglass to scan the horizon. Nothing but shimmering heat and distant mesas. The sun had begun its descent when Clara noticed movement to the northwest, not from the direction the men had gone. Adjusting the spyglass, she made out 2 riders approaching slowly. "Ernesto," she called, climbing down quickly. "Riders coming." The cook appeared with a shotgun. "Not our men?" Clara shook her head. 2 riders. Coming from town direction. They waited tensely on the porch. As the riders drew closer, Clara recognized the schoolteacher, Martha Wilson, accompanied by a young man who resembled her. "My son James," Martha introduced him after dismounting. "We bring news you should hear." Inside, Martha accepted a cup of water before speaking. "There's talk in town. Thornton's men were drinking in the saloon last night, boasting about teaching the Apache a lesson." James nodded in confirmation. "Said something about thinning his herd. Then this morning, they were showing off fresh cash. Dakota and the men went after stolen cattle," Clara explained. "Cut fence in the north pasture." Martha and James exchanged glances. "That's not all," Martha said gravely. "Sheriff Caldwell is gathering men. Claims Dakota stole cattle from the Johnson place last night." Clara stared in disbelief. "That's impossible. Dakota was here." "Truth matters little to Thornton," James said bitterly. "He wants Blackwater land, particularly the water rights. This is just his latest move." The implications settled heavily in the room. Clara's mind raced. "We need to warn Dakota. They could be riding into a trap." James stood. "I'll find them. Warn them about the sheriff." "I'll come with you," Clara decided, ignoring Ernesto's protest. "I know where they were headed." Minutes later, they were riding hard toward the north pasture. Clara led the way, remembering the route from previous cattle work. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, but fear pushed her forward. They found Diego first, standing guard over the cut fence. His expression darkened at their news. "Dakota and the others followed the trail west," he told them. "Said the tracks looked purposeful, not like normal rustlers." James nodded grimly. "Because they wanted to be followed." "Come on!" They rode west, following hoofprints clearly visible in the dry earth. Clara's heart pounded with each passing minute. If the sheriff's posse and Dakota's men met under these circumstances, blood would surely flow. Cresting a ridge, they spotted them. Dakota and Miguel had found the stolen cattle in a box canyon, the Blackwater brand clearly visible on their flanks. Too convenient, Clara realized. A setup, and in the distance, dust rising, riders approaching fast from the direction of town. "There," Clara pointed. "The sheriff's posse!" James cupped his hands around his mouth, shouting a warning. Dakota looked up sharply, hand moving to his rifle. When he spotted Clara, confusion crossed his features, quickly replaced by understanding as she gestured urgently toward the approaching dust cloud. Without hesitation, Dakota signaled Miguel to leave the cattle. Their lives were worth more than the stolen animals. As they rode up to join Clara and James, gunshots echoed in the distance. Warning shots, but the message was clear. Ambush, James explained rapidly. Thornton's men stole your cattle, then claimed you stole from Johnson. Sheriff's bringing men! Dakota's expression hardened as the pieces fell into place. Back to the ranch, he ordered. Different route now. As they rode, Clara explained everything Martha had told them. Dakota listened silently, but the tension in his jaw spoke volumes. They won't stop with cattle, he said finally. Thornton wants the water. He'll use any excuse. Clara thought of the distinctive brand on the stolen cattle, Dakota's mark, the symbol of all he had built, now being used against him in a deadly game where the rules were rigged and justice was just another weapon in Thornton's arsenal. Wider stance, Dakota instructed, adjusting Clara's position with a light touch to her shoulder. The rifle will kick. Be ready for it. Clara nodded, focusing on the line of bottles Dakota had arranged on the fence post 50 yards away. The Winchester felt heavy in her hands, its polished walnut stock smooth against her cheek. 3 days had passed since the cattle incident, and Dakota had decided everyone at Blackwater needed to be ready. Breathe in, he continued, his voice steady beside her. Exhale slowly as you squeeze the trigger. Don't pull. Clara followed his instructions, surprised when the rifle fired before she expected. The recoil jolted her shoulder, but she held firm. The bottle remained untouched. Again, Dakota said, not unkindly, but brooking no argument. By midday, Clara's shoulder ached and her ears rang, but 3 bottles lay shattered on the ground. Pride swelled in her chest at Dakota's nod of approval. You're a natural, Miguel commented, leaning against the corral fence. It took Diego a week to hit anything. Diego scowled good-naturedly. Not all of us grew up shooting. Clara lowered the rifle, careful to keep it pointed downrange, as Dakota had taught her. My father had a pistol. He showed me once, but we never had ammunition to spare for practice. The casual mention of her past slipped out before she could stop it. Clara rarely spoke of her life before the orphanage. Yet here, among these men who judged her on her merits rather than her history, the words came easier. You have good instincts, Dakota said, taking the Winchester and expertly checking that it was unloaded before setting it aside. That matters more than experience. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the ranch yard, James Wilson rode in with news. The men gathered on the porch as he dismounted. Sheriff's backing down for now, James reported. Johnson admitted he wasn't sure who took his cattle. Just assumed it was Blackwater men. Thornton overplayed his hand, Miguel suggested. Dakota's expression remained guarded. Or he's changing tactics, James nodded grimly. My mother overheard something at the mercantile. Thornton's been asking questions about land deeds. Oh, claims. Clara, bringing coffee to the men, felt Dakota stiffen beside her. What kind of questions? He asked, his voice carefully neutral. About the original grant, whether it was properly transferred. James accepted the coffee Clara offered. He's looking for legal angles to challenge your ownership. Later, after James had departed with promises to return if he learned more, Clara found Dakota in his study. Maps and papers covered his desk, illuminated by a single lamp. She hesitated in the doorway, suddenly aware she'd never entered this private space before. Come in, he said without looking up. Somehow he always knew when she was near. Is there truth to what James said? About the land grants? Clara asked, setting down the plate of food she'd brought. Dakota often forgot to eat when troubled. His fingers traced a boundary line on the yellowed map. My father purchased this land legally from the Spanish descendants who held the original grant. Everything was documented. He looked up, his dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. But papers can be lost. Witnesses die. And judges can be bought. Clara studied the map, recognizing the boundaries of Blackwater Ranch, 5 times the size of any other property in the region. The spring-fed creek that made it valuable even in drought ran through the northern section. We should hide copies of the deeds, she suggested. In different places? A smile ghosted across Dakota's face. We, he echoed softly. Heat rose to Clara's cheeks. I only meant, I know what you meant. His gaze held hers. Thank you. The simple acknowledgement warmed her more than any elaborate praise could have. In the weeks since her arrival, something had shifted between them. From employer and desperate girl to something Clara couldn't quite name. You did well today, Dakota said, changing the subject. With the Winchester. I still missed more than I hit, but you kept trying. He turned back to his papers. That's rare. Clara understood he wasn't just talking about the rifle practice. She had seen too many people give up when faced with adversity. In the orphanage, on the streets, in the small towns she'd passed through. Survival required persistence. Get some rest, Dakota advised. Tomorrow we check the western boundary. It's a long ride. As Clara turned to leave, Dakota spoke again. The rifle. It's yours now. Keep it clean. Keep it loaded. The Winchester had been hanging above the study door for years, Diego had told her. A fine weapon that Dakota rarely used, but maintained meticulously. Now it was hers. Not a loan, but a gift carrying significant meaning in this dangerous territory. I will, she promised. That night, Clara cleaned the rifle as Dakota had shown her, each movement deliberate and respectful. The weapon represented more than protection. It symbolized trust. Dakota believed she could defend herself, defend the ranch if needed. No one had ever had such faith in her capabilities. Outside, an owl called into the darkness. Clara finished her task and placed the Winchester beside her bed, loaded but with the hammer uncocked exactly as instructed. Whatever came next, Thornton, the sheriff, legal challenges or more direct threats, she would be ready. She was no longer just the starving orphan who had begged for work. She was becoming something else. Entirely someone who belonged at Blackwater Ranch. Someone who would fight to protect it. The locket had remained at the bottom of Clara's meager possessions since her arrival at Blackwater. Small and tarnished, its original silver barely visible beneath years of neglect, it held no monetary value. Its worth was purely sentimental, the only physical connection to her mother. Clara sat cross-legged on her bed, turning the locket over in her fingers. Tonight marked 2 months since she'd stumbled to Dakota's door, desperate and starving. The ranch had become home in ways the orphanage never had. Yet with James Wilson's warnings about Thornton investigating land claims, unease had settled over Blackwater like an approaching storm. Something about the talk of old documents had triggered fragmented memories. Her parents discussing papers, her father's worried face in lamplight. Too young to understand then, Clara now wondered if there had been more to their modest life than she recalled. She clicked open the locket. The tiny portraits inside had faded to ghostly outlines. Her mother's gentle smile, now just a suggestion. Her father's stern countenance equally indistinct. Clara had nearly forgotten their faces. The thought brought unexpected tears. As she wiped her eyes, her thumbnail caught on something. The backing of the locket seemed loose. Curious, Clara pressed gently, surprised when the interior plate shifted. Behind it was a tiny compartment she'd never discovered before. Inside lay a pearl hairpin, impossibly delicate for such a small hiding place. The craftsmanship was exquisite, far too fine for a farmer's wife, which was all Clara had believed her mother to be. A knock at her door startled her. "Clara?" Dakota's voice. She quickly tucked the hairpin into her pocket, but kept the locket in her hand. "Come in." Dakota rarely entered the small room that had become hers, respecting her privacy in a house full of men. He stood in the doorway now, his height emphasized by the room's low ceiling. "We found tracks again," he said. "Western boundary. Someone's been watching the ranch." Clara nodded, understanding the implications. "Thornton's men." "Likely." His gaze fell to the locket in her palm. "Family?" Clara hesitated, then extended her hand to show him. "My parents. The portraits have nearly faded now." Dakota stepped into the room, accepting the locket with careful hands. His calloused fingers looked oversized against the delicate object, yet he handled it with surprising gentleness. "You remember them well?" he asked. "Less each year," Clara admitted. "I was young when they died." Her hand moved unconsciously to the pearl hairpin in her pocket. "I just found something strange, though. hidden in the locket. She showed him the pearl hairpin, watching his expression shift to one of curiosity. "This was your mother's?" Clara nodded. "It seems too fine for a farmer's wife. My father worked land near Sacramento, at least that's what I was told." As they rode, Clara explained everything Martha had told them. Dakota listened silently, but the tension in his jaw spoke volumes. "They won't stop with cattle," he said finally. "Thornton wants the water. He'll use any excuse." Clara thought of the distinctive brand on the stolen cattle, Dakota's mark, the symbol of all he had built, now being used against him in a deadly game where the rules were rigged and justice was just another weapon in Thornton's arsenal. "Wider stance," Dakota instructed, adjusting Clara's position with a light touch to her shoulder. "The rifle will kick. Be ready for it." Clara nodded, focusing on the line of bottles Dakota had arranged on the fence post 50 yards away. The Winchester felt heavy in her hands, its polished walnut stock smooth against her cheek. 3 days had passed since the cattle incident, and Dakota had decided everyone at Blackwater needed to be ready. "Breathe in," he continued, his voice steady beside her. "Exhale slowly as you squeeze the trigger. Don't pull." Clara followed his instructions, surprised when the rifle fired before she expected. The recoil jolted her shoulder, but she held firm. The bottle remained untouched. "Again," Dakota said, not unkindly, but brooking no argument. By midday, Clara's shoulder ached and her ears rang, but 3 bottles lay shattered on the ground. Pride swelled in her chest at Dakota's nod of approval. "You're a natural," Miguel commented, leaning against the corral fence. "Took Diego a week to hit anything." Diego scowled good-naturedly. "Not all of us grew up shooting." Clara lowered the rifle, careful to keep it pointed down-range, as Dakota had taught her. "My father had a pistol. He showed me once, but we never had ammunition to spare for practice." The casual mention of her past slipped out before she could stop it. Clara rarely spoke of her life before the orphanage. Yet here, among these men who judged her on her merits rather than her history, the words came easier. "You have good instincts," Dakota said, taking the Winchester and expertly checking that it was unloaded before setting it aside. "That matters more than experience." That evening, as shadows lengthened across the ranch yard, James Wilson rode in with news. The men gathered on the porch as he dismounted. "Sheriff's backing down for now," James reported. Johnson admitted he wasn't sure who took his cattle. "Just assumed it was Blackwater men." "Thornton overplayed his hand," Miguel suggested. Dakota's expression remained guarded. "Or he's changing tactics," James nodded grimly. "My mother overheard something at the mercantile. Thornton's been asking questions about land deeds." "Old claims." Clara, bringing coffee to the men, felt Dakota stiffen beside her. "What kind of questions?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "About the original grant. Whether it was properly transferred." James accepted the coffee Clara offered. "He's looking for legal angles to challenge your ownership." Later, after James had departed with promises to return if he learned more, Clara found Dakota in his study. Maps and papers covered his desk, illuminated by a single lamp. She hesitated in the doorway, suddenly aware she'd never entered this private space before. "Come in," he said without looking up. Somehow he always knew when she was near. "Is there truth to what James said?" "About the land grants?" Clara asked, setting down the plate of food she'd brought. Dakota often forgot to eat when troubled. His fingers traced a boundary line on the yellowed map. "My father purchased this land legally from the Spanish descendants who held the original grant. Everything was documented." He looked up, his dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. "But papers can be lost, witnesses die, and judges can be bought." Clara studied the map, recognizing the boundaries of Blackwater Ranch, 5 times the size of any other property in the region. The spring-fed creek that made it valuable even in drought ran through the northern section. "We should hide copies of the deeds," she suggested. "In different places." A smile ghosted across Dakota's face. "We," he echoed softly. Heat rose to Clara's cheeks. "I only meant—" "I know what you meant." His gaze held hers. "Thank you." The simple acknowledgement warmed her more than any elaborate praise could have. In the weeks since her arrival, something had shifted between them, from employer and desperate girl to something Clara couldn't quite name. "You did well today," Dakota said, changing the subject. "With the Winchester. I still missed more than I hit, but you kept trying." He turned back to his papers. "That's rare." Clara understood he wasn't just talking about the rifle practice. She had seen too many people give up when faced with adversity, in the orphanage, on the streets, in the small towns she'd passed through. Survival required persistence. "Get some rest," Dakota advised. "Tomorrow we check the western boundary. It's a long ride." As Clara turned to leave, Dakota spoke again. "The rifle. It's yours now. Keep it clean, keep it loaded." The Winchester had been hanging above the study door for years, Diego had told her. A fine weapon that Dakota rarely used but maintained meticulously. Now it was hers, not a loan but a gift carrying significant meaning in this dangerous territory. "I will," she promised. That night, Clara cleaned the rifle as Dakota had shown her, each movement deliberate and respectful. The weapon represented more than protection. It symbolized trust. Dakota believed she could defend herself, defend the ranch if needed. No one had ever had such faith in her capabilities. Outside, an owl called into the darkness. Clara finished her task and placed the Winchester beside her bed, loaded but with the hammer uncocked, exactly as instructed. Whatever came next, Thornton, the sheriff, legal challenges or more direct threats, she would be ready. She was no longer just the starving orphan who had begged for work. She was becoming something else, entirely someone who belonged at Blackwater. Ranch, someone who would fight to protect it, the locket had remained at the bottom of Clara's meager possessions since her arrival at Blackwater. Small and tarnished, its original silver barely visible beneath years of neglect, it held no monetary value. Its worth was purely sentimental, the only physical connection to her mother. Clara sat cross-legged on her bed, turning the locket over in her fingers. Tonight marked 2 months since she'd stumbled to Dakota's door, desperate and starving. The ranch had become home in ways the orphanage never had. Yet with James Wilson's warnings about Thornton investigating land claims, unease had settled over Blackwater like an approaching storm. Something about the talk of old documents had triggered fragmented memories. Her parents discussing papers, her father's worried face in lamplight. Too young to understand then, Clara now wondered if there had been more to their modest life than she recalled. She clicked open the locket. The tiny portraits inside had faded to ghostly outlines. Her mother's gentle smile now just a suggestion, her father's stern countenance equally indistinct. Clara had nearly forgotten their faces. The thought brought unexpected tears. As she wiped her eyes, her thumbnail caught on something. The backing of the locket seemed loose. Curious, Clara pressed gently, surprised when the interior plate shifted. Behind it was a tiny compartment she'd never discovered before. Inside lay a pearl hairpin, impossibly delicate for such a small hiding place. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Far too fine for a farmer's wife, which was all Clara had believed her mother to be. A knock at her door startled her. "Clara?" Dakota's voice. She quickly tucked the hairpin into her pocket, but kept the locket in her hand. "Come in." Dakota rarely entered the small room that had become hers, respecting her privacy in a house full of men. He stood in the doorway now, his height emphasized by the room's low ceiling. "We found tracks again," he said. "Western boundary. Someone's been watching the ranch." Clara nodded, understanding the implications. "Thornton's men." "Likely." His gaze fell to the locket in her palm. "Family?" Clara hesitated, then extended her hand to show him. "My parents. The portraits have nearly faded now." Dakota stepped into the room, accepting the locket with careful hands. His calloused fingers looked oversized against the delicate object, yet he handled it with surprising gentleness. "You remember them well?" he asked. "Less each year," Clara admitted. "I was young when they died." Her hand moved unconsciously to the pearl hairpin in her pocket. "I just found something strange, though. Hidden in the locket. She showed him the pearl hairpin. Watching his esprit, Takoda returned the locket but studied the hairpin more closely. Good craftsmanship, European. I don't understand why she would hide it. Sometimes people leave their past behind. Start new. His eyes met hers. Sometimes by choice, sometimes by necessity. The words hung between them. Clara realized how little she knew about Takoda's past before Blackwater, just as he knew fragments of hers. Did you choose to leave your people's ways? She asked, surprising herself with the directness of the question. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Not entirely. I carry them with me. His hand moved briefly to where the eagle feather rested beneath his shirt. But this land called to me, reminded me of stories my grandmother told of our ancestral territories. It was the most he'd ever shared about his decision to establish the ranch. What will happen if Thornton finds some legal way to challenge your ownership? Clara asked, returning to the immediate concern. Takoda's expression hardened. I won't scission shift to one of curiosity. This was your mother's. Ooh. As they rode, Clara explained everything Martha had told them. Takoda listened silently, but the tension in his jaw spoke volumes. They won't stop with cattle, he said finally. Thornton wants the water. He'll use any excuse. Clara thought of the distinctive brand on the stolen cattle, Takoda's mark, the symbol of all he had built, now being used against him in a deadly game where the rules were rigged and justice was just another weapon in Thornton's arsenal. Wider stance, Takoda instructed, adjusting Clara's position with a light touch to her shoulder. The rifle will kick. Be ready for it. Clara nodded, focusing on the line of bottles Takoda had arranged on the fence post 50 yards away. The Winchester felt heavy in her hands, its polished walnut stock smooth against her cheek. 3 days had passed since the cattle incident, and Takoda had decided everyone at Blackwater needed to be ready. Breathe in, he continued, his voice steady beside her. Exhale slowly as you squeeze the trigger. Don't pull. Clara followed his instructions, surprised when the rifle fired before she expected. The recoil jolted her shoulder, but she held firm. The bottle remained untouched. Again, Takoda said. Not unkindly, but brooking no argument. By midday, Clara's shoulder ached and her ears rang, but 3 bottles lay shattered on the ground. Pride swelled in her chest at Takoda's nod of approval. You're a natural, Miguel commented, leaning against the corral fence. Took Diego a week to hit anything. Diego scowled good-naturedly. Not all of us grew up shooting. Clara lowered the rifle, careful to keep it pointed downrange as Takoda had taught her. My father had a pistol. He showed me once, but we never had ammunition to spare for practice. The casual mention of her past slipped out before she could stop it. Clara rarely spoke of her life before the orphanage. Yet here, among these men, who judged her on her merits rather than her history, the words came easier. You have good instincts, Takoda said, taking the Winchester and expertly checking that it was unloaded before setting it aside. That matters more than experience. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the ranch yard, James Wilson rode in with news. The men gathered on the porch as he dismounted. Sheriff's backing down for now, James reported. Johnson admitted he wasn't sure who took his cattle, just assumed it was Blackwater men. Thornton overplayed his hand, Miguel suggested. Takoda's expression remained guarded. Or he's changing tactics. James nodded grimly. My mother overheard something at the mercantile. Thornton's been asking questions about land deeds, old claims. Clara, bringing coffee to the men, felt Takoda stiffen beside her. What kind of questions? He asked, his voice carefully neutral. About the original grant, whether it was properly transferred. James accepted the coffee Clara offered. He's looking for legal angles to challenge your ownership. Later, after James had departed with promises to return if he learned more, Clara found Takoda in his study. Maps and papers covered his desk, illuminated by a single lamp. She hesitated in the doorway, suddenly aware she'd never entered this private space before. "Come in," he said, without looking up. Somehow, he always knew when she was near. "Is there a truth to what James said about the land grants?" Clara asked, setting down the plate of food she'd brought. Dakota often forgot to eat when troubled. His fingers traced a boundary line on the yellowed map. "My father purchased this land legally from the Spanish descendants who held the original grant. Everything was documented." He looked up, his dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. "But papers can be lost, witnesses die, and judges can be bought." Clara studied the map, recognizing the boundaries of Blackwater Ranch, 5 times the size of any other property in the region. The spring-fed creek that made it valuable even in drought ran through the northern section. "We should hide copies of the deeds," she suggested, "in different places." A smile ghosted across Dakota's face. "We," he echoed softly. Heat rose to Clara's cheeks. "I only meant, I know what you meant." His gaze held hers. "Thank you." The simple acknowledgement warmed her more than any elaborate praise could have. In the weeks since her arrival, something had shifted between them. From employer and desperate girl to something Clara couldn't quite name. "You did well today," Dakota said, changing the subject. "With the Winchester, I still missed more than I hit, but you kept trying." He turned back to his papers. "That's rare." Clara understood he wasn't just talking about the rifle practice. She had seen too many people give up when faced with adversity. In the orphanage, on the streets, in the small towns she'd passed through. Survival required persistence. "Get some rest," Dakota advised. "Tomorrow we check the western boundary. It's a long ride." As Clara turned to leave, Dakota spoke again. "The rifle, it's yours now. Keep it clean, keep it loaded." The Winchester had been hanging above the study door for years, Diego had told her. A fine weapon that Dakota rarely used but maintained meticulously. Now it was hers, not a loan, but a gift carrying significant meaning in this dangerous territory. "I will," she promised. That night, Clara cleaned the rifle as Dakota had shown her, each movement deliberate and respectful. The weapon represented more than protection. It symbolized trust. Dakota believed she could defend herself, defend the ranch if needed. No one had ever had such faith in her capabilities. Outside, an owl called into the darkness. Clara finished her task and placed the Winchester beside her bed, loaded but with the hammer uncocked, exactly as instructed. Whatever came next, Thornton, the sheriff, legal challenges, or more direct threats, she would be ready. She was no longer just the starving orphan who had begged for work. She was becoming something else entirely. Someone who belonged at Blackwater Ranch. Someone who would fight to protect it. The locket had remained at the bottom of Clara's meager possessions since her arrival at Blackwater. Small and tarnished, its original silver barely visible beneath years of neglect, it held no monetary value. Its worth was purely sentimental, the only physical connection to her mother. Clara sat cross-legged on her bed, turning the locket over in her fingers. Tonight marked 2 months since she'd stumbled to Dakota's door, desperate and starving. The ranch had become home in ways the orphanage never had, yet with James Wilson's warnings about Thornton investigating land claims, unease had settled over Blackwater like an approaching storm. Something about the talk of old documents had triggered fragmented memories. Her parents discussing papers, her father's worried face in lamplight. Too young to understand then, Clara now wondered if there had been more to their modest life than she recalled. She clicked open the locket. The tiny portraits inside had faded to ghostly outlines, her mother's gentle smile now just a suggestion, her father's stern countenance equally indistinct. Clara had nearly forgotten their faces. The thought brought unexpected tears. As she wiped her eyes, her thumbnail caught on something. The backing of the locket seemed loose. Curious, Clara pressed gently, surprised when the interior plate shifted. Behind it was a tiny compartment she'd never discovered before. Inside lay a pearl hairpin, impossibly delicate for such a small hiding place. The craftsmanship was exquisite, far too fine for a farmer's wife, which was all Clara had believed her mother to be. A knock at her door startled her. "Clara?" Dakota's voice. She quickly tucked the hairpin into her pocket but kept the locket in her hand. "Come in." Dakota rarely entered the small room that had become hers, respecting her privacy in a house full of men. He stood in the doorway now, his height emphasized by the room's low ceiling. "We found tracks again," he said. "Western boundary. Someone's been watching the ranch." Clara nodded, understanding the implications. Thornton's men? Likely. His gaze fell to the locket in her palm. "Family!" Clara hesitated, then extended her hand to show him. "My parents. The portraits have nearly faded now." Dakota stepped into the room, accepting the locket with careful hands. His calloused fingers looked oversized against the delicate object, yet he handled it with surprising gentleness. "You remember them well?" he asked. "Less each year," Clara admitted. "I was young when they died." Her hand moved unconsciously to the pearl hairpin in her pocket. "I just found something strange, though, hidden in the locket." She showed him. The pearl hairpin. Watching his expression, Dakota returned the locket, but studied the hairpin more closely. Good craftsmanship, European. I don't understand why she would hide it. Sometimes people leave their past behind, start new. His eyes met hers. Sometimes by choice, sometimes by necessity. The words hung between them. Clara realized how little she knew about Dakota's past before Blackwater, just as he knew fragments of hers. "Did you choose to leave your people's ways?" she asked, surprising herself with the directness of the question. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Not entirely. I carry them with me." His hand moved briefly to where the eagle feather rested beneath his shirt. "But this land called to me, reminded me of stories my grandmother told of our ancestral territories. It was the most he'd ever shared about his decision to establish the ranch. What will happen if Thornton finds some legal way to challenge your ownership?" Clara asked, returning to the immediate concern. Dakota's expression hardened. "I won't see and shift to one of curiosity. This was your mother's." Clara nodded. "It seems too fine for a farmer's wife. My father worked land near Sacramento, at least that's what I was told." Dakota returned the locket, but studied the hairpin more closely. "Good craftsmanship, European. I don't understand why she would hide it. Sometimes people leave their past behind. Start new." His eyes met hers. "Sometimes by choice, sometimes by necessity." The words hung between them. Clara realized how little she knew about Dakota's past before Blackwater, just as he knew fragments of hers. "Did you choose to leave your people's ways?" she asked, surprising herself with the directness of the question. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Not entirely. I carry them with me." His hand moved briefly to where the eagle feather rested beneath his shirt. "But this land called to me, reminded me of stories my grandmother told of our ancestral territories. It was the most he'd ever shared about his decision to establish the ranch. What will happen if Thornton finds some legal way to challenge your ownership?" Clara asked, returning to the immediate concern. Dakota's expression hardened. "I won't surrender what I've built. Not to him, not to anyone. We could look for records in town," Clara suggested. "Martha might help." Dakota studied her for a long moment. "Your interest in this fight goes beyond employment." It wasn't a question, but Clara answered anyway. "Blackwater is the first place that's felt like home since my parents died." Her fingers closed around the pearl hairpin. "I won't let Thornton take that away without a fight." Something shifted in Dakota's eyes, recognition, perhaps, of the determination they shared. He nodded once. "Tomorrow we ride to town. Speak with Martha." He turned to leave, then paused. "Keep that hairpin close. Family connections can matter in unexpected ways." After he left, Clara examined the hairpin again under the lamplight. Its elegant craftsmanship suggested a life far different from the hard-scrabble existence she remembered. Had her mother come from wealth? Had her parents been running from something or someone? She tucked the hairpin and locket safely away, thoughts churning. Two mysteries now demanded her attention: her own clouded past and the threat to Blackwater's future. Somehow, she sensed they might be more connected than she could yet understand. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window in its frame. Clara reached for the Winchester beside her bed, drawing comfort from its solid presence. Whatever came next, whether answers about her family or confrontation with Thornton, she would face it head-on. No longer the frightened orphan, but a woman with purpose and place. For the first time in years, Clara fell asleep, thinking not of survival but of belonging, and of the man whose dark eyes had seen something in her worth saving on that desperate day she'd arrived at his door. Redemption looked different in the golden light of late afternoon. The main street bustled with activity as townspeople prepared for the annual harvest festival. Colorful bunting stretched between buildings, and the smell of baking pies drifted from open windows. Clara rode beside Dakota, aware of curious glances as they made their way to Martha Wilson's modest house near the schoolhouse. After the confrontations of their previous visit, the festive atmosphere felt surreal. The town changes for festival day, Dakota observed, following her gaze. Even enemies find reason to be civil. Martha welcomed them warmly, ushering them inside before neighbors could gossip. James sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by old ledgers and documents. "I've been researching land records," he explained, pushing forward a leather-bound book. "The county registry shows clear title transfer to your father in 1859. Everything appears legitimate." Dakota nodded, relief briefly softening his features. Thornton's challenge would fail in any fair court. Fair being the operative word, Martha noted, pouring coffee. "Judge Patterson owes Thornton for his appointment." Clara studied the registry entries, while the others discussed legal strategies. The careful script documented decades of ownership transfers throughout the territory. Her eye caught on a familiar name several pages from Dakota's entry. "Hargrove," she murmured, the name sending an unexpected chill through her. James leaned over. "That was the Silver Creek property. Abandoned now. Hargrove was my mother's maiden name," Clara explained, her finger tracing the entry. "Eleanor Hargrove. Before she married my father, John Reed." Silence fell as the implications registered. Martha was the first to recover. The Hargroves were a prominent family once. They owned substantial silver mining interests before the crash of '73. "My mother never mentioned this," Clara said, struggling to reconcile this information with her childhood memories. The pearl hairpin suddenly made more sense, a relic of a prosperous past. "Many lost everything in that financial collapse," James explained. "Some moved west to start again, or to hide," Dakota added quietly. Before they could discuss further, a knock interrupted them. Martha opened the door to a plump woman whose eyes widened at the sight of Dakota and Clara. "Mrs. Landry," Martha greeted her. "What brings you by?" "Dance cards for the festival committee," the woman replied, unable to hide her curiosity. She held out a stack of small booklets tied with ribbons. "I didn't realize you had guests." Martha took the items. "Mr. Blackwater and Miss Reed are assisting me with historical research." Mrs. Landry's gaze lingered on Clara. "Will you be attending the festival tomorrow, Miss Reed?" The question caught Clara off guard. She hadn't considered participating in town celebrations, given the hostility they'd faced previously. "We came for business," Dakota answered for her. Something in Martha's expression shifted, a flash of determination. "Nonsense. You both must attend." She selected one of the booklets and pressed it into Clara's hand. "Every young woman needs a dance card for her first harvest festival." After Mrs. Landry departed, visibly bursting with gossip, Martha explained her thinking. "Appearing at social functions establishes legitimacy. If Thornton wants to challenge you, make it harder by becoming part of the community fabric." "The town hasn't exactly welcomed us," Clara reminded her. "Some have," James countered. "Others might, given the chance to know you beyond rumors. Later, As they rode back to Blackwater, the dance card tucked safely in Clara's pocket. Dakota remained thoughtful. "Martha's strategy has merit," he finally said. "I've kept to myself too long. It makes me an easier target. You'll actually attend the festival." Clara couldn't hide her surprise. The corner of Dakota's mouth lifted slightly. "My father believed in understanding potential adversaries, or to do that from a distance." The next evening found Clara standing before a cracked mirror in her room, hardly recognizing herself. Martha had sent over a dress, not new but well made, a deep blue that complemented Clara's eyes. Ernesto's wife, who visited occasionally from the neighboring town, had helped arrange her hair, incorporating the pearl hairpin as a final touch. When Clara emerged, the ranch hand's expressions of astonishment would have been comical under different circumstances. Miguel whistled appreciatively until Dakota's sharp glance silenced him. Dakota himself had made concessions to the occasion, wearing a crisp white shirt beneath his black vest. He'd trimmed his hair, but kept it long in the Apache tradition. The effect was striking, a man honoring both aspects of his heritage without compromising either. "You look," he began, then seemed to reconsider his words. "The hairpin suits you." It was the closest thing to a compliment Dakota had ever offered, and Clara treasured it more than any elaborate praise. The festival glowed with lantern light when they arrived. Music spilled from the town hall, and tables groaned beneath the weight of harvest bounty. Conversations faltered as they entered, but Martha quickly approached, drawing them into a group of her friends. "Your first dance card," she said to Clara, indicating the small booklet now dangling from Clara's wrist by a blue ribbon. Traditionally, gentlemen request dances and sign their names in the slots. Clara doubted any man would approach her, given her association with Dakota. Yet as the evening progressed, James claimed the first dance, followed by the blacksmith's son, and even the young deputy, who seemed to operate independently of the sheriff's prejudices. Between dances, Clara found herself standing beside Dakota, watching the whirling couples. "You don't dance?" she asked, noting his observant stillness. "I know how," he replied, surprising her. "My mother insisted I learn both Apache ceremonies and white social customs." The fiddle struck up a slower tune, and something shifted in Dakota's expression. Before Clara could decipher it, he held out his hand. "May I?" Clara nodded, unable to speak as his hand closed around hers. The touch sent warmth spreading through her as he led her onto the floor, into a dance that would soon become the most scandalous and discussed event of the Harvest Festival. The moment when the Alpha Apache claimed a dance with the mysterious young woman who had appeared from nowhere to become part of his household. "He can't be serious." Clara stared at the official-looking document that Sheriff Caldwell had delivered to Blackwater Ranch that morning. Dakota remained silent, reading through the legal summons for the third time. The ranch hands had gathered in the main house, tension thick in the air. "It says your deed is incomplete," Miguel said, peering over Dakota's shoulder. "What does that even mean?" "It means Thornton found a judge willing to question my ownership," Dakota replied, his voice controlled despite the anger evident in his rigid posture. "Court hearing in 3 days. Clara watched as Dakota crossed to the heavy oak cabinet where he kept important papers. From a hidden compartment, he withdrew a worn leather portfolio. Inside lay the original deed to Blackwater Ranch, its edges yellowed with age, but the text still clear, except for the bottom right corner, which had been torn away decades ago. "The missing corner," Dakota explained, seeing Clara's confusion. "It contained part of the notary's seal and signature. My father said it was damaged when they fled Apache territory during the wars. I never thought it would matter." "But you've owned this land for years," Clara protested. "Paid taxes, built a ranch. How can they suddenly claim it's not valid?" "Money," Diego said bitterly. "Thornton wants the water, and the drought makes it worth more than gold." Dakota carefully returned the deed to its portfolio. "We have copies in town records. James found them, but Thornton has influence with the county clerk," Clara reminded him. "What if those records are lost before the hearing?" The possibility hung heavy in the room. Without documentation, Dakota's claim to Blackwater would rest solely on a damaged deed and his word against Thornton's considerable influence. After the men dispersed to their duties, Clara remained with Dakota in the main house. He stood by the window, looking out over the land that had been his life's work. "There must be someone who remembers your father's purchase," Clara suggested. "Witnesses? Most are dead now." "It was a long time ago." Dakota turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "But you're right to think that way. We need more than paper to fight this." Clara hesitated, then asked the question that had been troubling her since the sheriff's visit. "What happens if they rule against you?" "They won't take Blackwater without a fight." His hand moved instinctively to where his father's knife was always sheathed at his belt. "There are other ways to fight," Clara said quietly. "Martha and James are respected in town, and after the festival, others spoke to us as well. The harvest dance had indeed changed something. Though many still viewed them with suspicion, a few townspeople had nodded in greeting, some even engaging in cautious conversation. The blacksmith had offered to repair Dakota's tools at fair prices, and the mercantile owner had mentioned having Apache customers wasn't so bad for business, after all. Small steps, but meaningful ones. Dakota seemed about to respond when hoofbeats approached at speed. They moved to the porch as Miguel rode in, his horse lathered with exertion. "Riders at the north boundary," he reported breathlessly. "Thornton's men! They're putting up stakes along the creek." Dakota's expression darkened. "Get the others." "Dakota," Clara caught his arm. "This could be a trap. The summons, then this provocation. They're trying to force you into action they can use against you in court." Their eyes met, and Clara saw the struggle within him. The warrior's instinct to defend his territory, battling with the rancher's understanding of legal consequences. "She's right," Miguel said reluctantly. "This is too convenient." Dakota nodded once. "We'll document the trespass." Nothing more. Clara rode with them to the north boundary, her Winchester across her saddle. The sight that greeted them was even more brazen than Miguel had described. 6 of Thornton's men were driving wooden stakes along both sides of the creek, essentially claiming the most valuable water source on Blackwater property. "That's far enough," Dakota called as they approached, his voice carrying across the distance. Thornton's foreman, a surly man named Hatch, looked up with a smirk. "Public notice of claim dispute," he said, waving a document similar to the summons. "We're marking the contested boundary according to the original Spanish grant lines. This is still my land until a court says otherwise," Dakota replied evenly. "Not for long," another man muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Clara felt the tension radiating from Dakota and the ranch hands. One wrong move could escalate into violence, exactly what Thornton wanted. She edged her horse forward. "We're documenting this trespass," she announced, pulling out the small notebook she'd brought. Names, time, location. For the judge, her unexpected action seemed to confuse Thornton's men. Hatch's smirk faltered as Clara calmly wrote down details, describing each man and their activities. "The girl's playing lawyer now," one of them sneered. "The girl is ensuring that when Mr. Blackwater retains his property rights, you'll all face trespassing charges," Clara replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Unless you'd like to leave now and avoid that outcome." Her boldness bought precious moments for Dakota to master his anger. When he spoke again, his voice carried authority without aggression. "You've made your statement. Now get off my land before I exercise my right to remove trespassers." The implied threat, combined with Clara's documentation and the armed ranch hands flanking Dakota, created enough doubt to sway Thornton's men. With muttered curses, they mounted up and rode off, leaving the stakes as their only victory. As they watched them go, Dakota turned to Clara. "That was quick thinking." She shrugged, tucking away her notebook. "Thornton wants to fight with guns. We need to fight with his weapons, law and public opinion." Dakota studied her with new appreciation. "You continue to surprise me, Clara Reed." Looking down at the stakes marking what could become the new boundary of a diminished Blackwater ranch, Clara silently vowed that Thornton would not win this battle, not against the land that had become her home, nor against the man who had given her a second chance at life. The dusty archives of Redemption's small newspaper office smelled of ink and forgotten stories. Clara and Martha Wilson sorted through stacks of bound volumes, searching for anything that might help Dakota's case. James had gone to the county seat to examine additional records, while Dakota met with a lawyer who had reluctantly agreed to represent him. Land disputes, water rights, property transfers, Martha muttered, flipping pages. So many broken dreams documented in these pages. Clara nodded absently, her attention caught by a name in a paper dated 15 years earlier. Hargrove, her mother's family name. Heart-quickening, she pulled the volume closer. The article was small, relegated to page 4. A brief notice reprinted from a Sacramento newspaper about the deaths of William and Catherine Hargrove, prominent members of society found murdered in their home. Their young daughter, heir to the considerable Hargrove fortune, was missing and presumed dead. "Martha," Clara whispered, her voice strange to her own ears. "Look at this!" Martha adjusted her spectacles, reading where Clara pointed. "Hargrove murders. How terrible. You think these people were related to your mother?" "Not related," Clara said, pieces falling into place like a puzzle box finally unlocked. "My grandparents, and the missing girl," she swallowed hard. "Was me." Martha's hand flew to her mouth. "Clara, are you certain?" Memories surfaced, fragmented but vivid, being bundled into a wagon at night. Her mother weeping quietly. Her father's grim face as he burned papers by a roadside campfire. New names, new stories. Never talk about California. Never mention the Hargroves. They were protecting me, Clara realized. They changed our names, became farmers instead of... Her fingers traced the words considerable fortune, instead of whatever they were before. Martha squeezed her hand. "Your parents must have had good reason." Clara nodded, shock giving way to determination. "We need to find more about this. Who was responsible for the murders? Why did my parents flee with me instead of seeking justice?" They searched with renewed purpose, finding scattered references to the unsolved Hargrove case. One article mentioned business disputes with a mining consortium. Another speculated about inheritance motives. Then Martha gasped, holding up a paper from 12 years ago. "Clara, look at this photograph." The grainy image showed men at a mining investment meeting. Clara recognized none of them, until Martha pointed to a younger but unmistakable Silas Thornton, identified as representative of Eastern investors in Western territories. It could be coincidence, Clara said, though certainty grew within her. Perhaps, Martha agreed, but coincidences make poor explanations for murder. When Dakota found them later, Clara showed him the articles without explanation. He read carefully, his expression darkening as he connected the implications. "You believe this is your family?" he stated, rather than asked. "And that Thornton was involved," Clara nodded. "The timing fits. The Hargroves were killed, their fortune disappeared, and suddenly Thornton had capital to invest in land and cattle." Dakota's hand covered hers briefly. "This changes our approach. If Thornton recognizes you..." "He's never seen me up close," Clara interrupted. "And I was only a child then. Still, it's dangerous." Dakota studied the newspaper photo, his jaw tight. "But it gives us leverage. A man who would murder for money wouldn't hesitate to falsify land claims." That evening, as they rode back to Blackwater, Clara felt strangely calm despite the day's revelations. The world had shifted, her past rewritten, yet she felt more certain of her path than ever before. "What will you do?" Dakota asked as the ranch appeared on the horizon. "If this is true, there may be an inheritance waiting." The question caught Clara by surprise. She hadn't considered the practical implications of her discovery, only the truth it revealed about her parents' actions and possibly Thornton's crimes. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "But wealth was never what I sought when I came to your door." Something flickered in Dakota's eyes, a question perhaps about what she had found instead. But he remained silent as they rode the final distance home. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, the newspaper clippings spread before her alongside the pearl hairpin. Parts of herself that had been missing for so long, identity, history, purpose, were gradually taking shape. A soft knock drew her attention. Takoda stood in her doorway, his expression solemn. "James sent a rider," he said. "Thornton's lawyer filed additional claims today. He's challenging not just the water rights, but the entire ranch." Clara rose, anger replacing shock. "Based on what grounds?" "A newly discovered document suggesting my father's payment for the land was never completed." Takoda's voice remained controlled, but Clara saw the tension in his stance. "The hearing has been moved up, day after tomorrow." "He's rushing because he's afraid," Clara realized. "If we connect him to the Hargrove murders, it's speculation without proof," Takoda cautioned. "And dangerous speculation at that." Clara stood straighter, decision crystallizing. "Then we need proof. My parents hid things in the locket. Perhaps there's more I don't remember. Papers? Evidence." Takoda studied her with an intensity that might have made her uncomfortable once. Now she met his gaze steadily. "You're putting yourself at risk," he said finally. "For land that isn't yours." Clara thought of the newspaper clipping, the faces of grandparents she couldn't remember, parents who had died protecting her. She thought of Blackwater Ranch, of Takoda's quiet strength, of the home and purpose she'd found here. "I'm putting myself at risk for justice," she corrected gently, "and for a place that has become mine in every way that matters." In the silence that followed, something shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings neither had dared voice. Takoda moved closer, one hand lifting to touch her cheek with unexpected tenderness. "Clara Reed," he said softly, "or Clara Hargrove. Whoever you choose to be, you've brought something to Blackwater I didn't know was missing." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her with the newspaper clipping that had changed everything and the certainty that, whatever came next, they would face it together. The town hall of redemption had never seen such a gathering. Ranchers from outlying properties stood shoulder to shoulder with merchants, farmers, and townspeople, all drawn by Martha Wilson's urgent message that Takoda Blackwater needed their support. Clara watched from near the podium as James Wilson addressed the crowd, explaining Thornton's legal maneuver and its implications beyond Blackwater Ranch. "Today it's Takoda's water rights," James said, his voice carrying to the back of the room. "Tomorrow it could be your grazing land, your store lease, your homestead. If a man's rightful claim can be invalidated after decades, none of our properties are secure." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. Clara noted the faces present, not just the Wilsons' friends, but people who had previously kept their distance from Takoda. The blacksmith and his family, the mercantile owner, even a few cowboys from neighboring spreads who had once eyed Takoda with suspicion. Not everyone from town had come, of course. Sheriff Caldwell was conspicuously absent, as were Thornton's associates and those most dependent on his business. But more had answered the call than Clara had dared hope. "What can we do?" called the blacksmith. "Judge Patterson won't rule against Thornton no matter what the law says. We make our voices heard," Martha replied, unfolding a document on the table before her. "I've drafted a petition affirming community recognition of Takoda's rightful ownership of Blackwater Ranch, dating back to his father's purchase. It won't override the law, but it demonstrates that Thornton stands alone in challenging a claim the community has accepted for generations." As Martha explained the petition's purpose, Clara moved to where Takoda stood slightly apart from the gathering, his face impassive, but his eyes revealing surprise at the turnout. "I didn't expect this," he admitted quietly to her. "Most of these people barely acknowledge me in the street." "Things are changing," Clara replied. "Your dance with the mysterious orphan girl caused quite a stir." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Your doing, not mine." "Our doing," she corrected gently. "Martha was right. Isolation made you vulnerable. These people may have their prejudices, but they understand the threat Thornton poses to all of them." Across the room, James raised his voice again. We also need witnesses at tomorrow's hearing. The courthouse must be filled with faces the judge recognizes. His neighbors, his church members, people he'll have to face in town afterward. The blacksmith stepped forward first. Taking the pen, Martha offered to sign the petition. I'll be there. Patterson shoed his horses at my forge last month. Let him try to ignore me. One by one, others came forward. The baker, the seamstress, 3 neighboring ranchers. Even the young deputy signed, though he did so quickly and left immediately after. As the signatures accumulated, Clara felt a weight lifting. They were no longer fighting alone. Even if Thornton had corrupted the legal process, he would now have to contend with public opinion, a powerful force in a small community. There's something else, Martha announced as the signing continued. Something potentially more significant. She nodded to Clara. Heart pounding, Clara moved to the front of the room. She had discussed this moment with Dakota and the Wilsons, weighing the risks against the advantages of revealing what they'd discovered. My name is Clara Reed, she began, her voice steadier than she felt. At least that's the name I've used since childhood. Recently, I discovered my true identity. She held up the newspaper clipping. I am Clara Hargrove, granddaughter of William and Catherine Hargrove of Sacramento, who were murdered 15 years ago. A stunned silence fell over the gathering. Clara continued, explaining the evidence connecting Thornton to the Hargrove business dealings before their deaths, his sudden financial rise afterward, and his possible motives for eliminating the family. I believe Silas Thornton may be responsible for my grandparents' murders and the theft of their fortune, she concluded. The same man now attempting to steal Blackwater Ranch through legal manipulation. The room erupted in exclamations of shock and questions. Martha restored order, clarifying that while they had circumstantial evidence, they needed time to gather proof. Time that Thornton was trying to deny them by rushing the hearing. So we're fighting not just for Blackwater, but to expose a murderer. The mercantile owner asked. We're fighting for justice on multiple fronts, James confirmed, and against a man who has manipulated this community for too long. As the meeting concluded, people approached Clara, some with sympathy, others with questions. A few offering information about Thornton's past dealings that might prove useful. The petition circulated, gaining more signatures than anyone had anticipated. Dakota found her as the crowd dispersed. That took courage, he said, his voice low. Thornton will know who you are now. Good, Clara replied with more confidence than she truly felt. Let him worry about what evidence died with my parents and what might have survived. Outside, as dusk settled over redemption, Clara watched townspeople dispersing in groups, voices animated with discussion of the revelations. The coalition petition had transformed from Martha's hopeful idea into a powerful statement of community solidarity. Will it be enough? She asked, as she and Dakota mounted their horses for the ride back to Blackwater. Dakota's gaze swept over the town, then returned to her face with unexpected warmth. It's more than I ever expected. You've given me that? As they rode home beneath a canopy of emerging stars, Clara felt a curious blend of fear and hope. Tomorrow would bring the hearing that might determine Blackwater's fate, and with Thornton now alerted to her identity, perhaps her own fate as well. Yet she wasn't alone. Neither was Dakota. And in that knowledge lay a strength that even Thornton's money and influence might not be able to overcome. The courthouse steps teemed with people as Clara and Dakota arrived for the hearing. True to their word, townspeople had turned out in numbers that surprised even Martha Wilson, who greeted them with cautious optimism. Judge Patterson looks nervous, she whispered, nodding toward the portly figure hurrying into the building. He expected to quietly rule in Thornton's favor, not face half the town. Inside, the courtroom could barely contain the crowd. Dakota's lawyer, a skeptical man named Bennett, who had initially taken the case as a favor to James, seemed bolstered by the unexpected support. Silas Thornton sat at the opposing table, his expression a careful mask that slipped only when he spotted Clara, revealing a flash of recognition and calculation that confirmed her suspicions. As the proceedings began, Thornton's strategy became clear. His lawyer presented the damaged deed, emphasizing the missing corner with its partial notary seal as evidence of potential fraud. He produced a recently discovered receipt showing incomplete payment for the land, suggesting Dakota's father had never finalized the purchase. Bennett countered by presenting the county records James had secured, testimony from elderly residents who remembered Dakota's father completing the purchase, and the petition signed by current community members affirming decades of recognized ownership. Judge Patterson shifted uncomfortably as the courtroom filled with murmurs of support whenever a point was made in Dakota's favor. Clara could see his dilemma: rule for Thornton as planned and face community backlash, or rule justly and risk Thornton's displeasure. Near midday, the judge called a recess. As people filed outside, Clara overheard snippets of conversation about her revelation from yesterday's meeting. Thornton's potential connection to the Hargrove murders had spread through town like wildfire, casting his land grab in an even more sinister light. "We need more than suspicion," Dakota said quietly as they stood apart from the crowd. "The judge is wavering, but Thornton's evidence is compelling enough to give him cover if he rules against us." Clara nodded. "I've been thinking about that. My parents must have had proof of whatever Thornton did, something threatening enough to make them flee with me and change our identities." "You believe they hid it somewhere?" "My father always said, keep something precious where no one would think to look." Clara touched the locket at her throat. "Like the hairpin hidden in this. What if there was more?" "You mean back in California?" Clara shook her head. "Too far, too obvious. But my parents had a small homestead near Silver Creek before the fever took them. I was sent to the orphanage, and their belongings—" She paused, memory surfacing. "Their trunk was stored with the church pastor. He said I could claim it when I came of age, but by then I was just trying to survive." Dakota's eyes sharpened with interest. "Silver Creek is 2 days' ride from here. If the trunk is still there, it might contain evidence," Clara reasoned. "Letters, documents, something to connect Thornton to my grandparents' deaths." Before Dakota could respond, the court was called back into session. The afternoon proceeded with technical arguments about water rights and boundary lines. Judge Patterson repeatedly glanced at the filled benches, clearly disturbed by the public interest in what should have been a routine case. Finally, he cleared his throat. "This matter requires further consideration. I'm continuing this hearing for 1 week to review all evidence presented. A postponement, not a victory, but not the immediate defeat Thornton had clearly expected." His face darkened as he conferred with his lawyer, shooting a venomous glance toward Clara and Dakota. Outside, Bennett looked relieved. "It's the best outcome we could hope for today. The community presence made a difference." "A week gives us time," Clara said to Dakota as they walked to their horses. "I could ride to Silver Creek, look for the trunk." Dakota frowned. "Not alone. Not with Thornton now aware of who you are." "The ranch needs you," Clara countered. "And Thornton will be watching your movements closely." Their discussion continued that evening at Blackwater. The ranch hands gathered in the main house, debating strategies for the coming week. "I'll go with Clara," Miguel volunteered. "2 riders are safer than 1. Dakota studied his trusted foreman, then nodded reluctantly. "Leave before dawn. Take the western route, then cut north. Less chance of being followed." Later, as preparations were made for the journey, Clara found Dakota on the porch, his face troubled in the fading light. "We've faced worse odds," she offered, standing beside him. "Different stakes," he replied. "Before it was land, water, cattle. Now—" He turned to her, his expression softening. "Now there's more to lose." The unspoken sentiment hung between them, more powerful for not being voiced. Clara's hand found his, their fingers intertwining briefly before he pulled away, uncomfortable with even this small display where others might see. "Be careful," he said simply. "Thornton is desperate now." "A desperate man is unpredictable." Clara nodded, about to respond, when Diego approached with supplies for the journey. As they discussed provisions, neither noticed the shadow that detached itself from the barn and moved toward the bunkhouse. Inside, by lantern light, a hurried note was scratched on a scrap of paper. Girl leaving before dawn. Western route, then north to Silver Creek. Searching for evidence about Hargrove murders. M. The betrayal letter was folded small and tucked into a saddlebag, its author returning to the main house in time to wish Clara good night with a seemingly loyal smile that masked the $50 Thornton had paid him months ago, just waiting for information worth the price. The Western Trail wound through rocky terrain, skirting the edge of Blackwater property before turning north toward Silver Creek. Clara and Miguel had been riding since before dawn, the first pale light now warming their backs as they pushed their mounts at a steady pace. "We should reach Miller's Creek by noon," Miguel said, checking the position of the sun. "Rest the horses there before continuing." Clara nodded, adjusting the small knife tucked into her boot, a precaution Dakota had insisted upon before they left. Its bone handle was smooth from years of use, the blade sharp enough to slice paper. "A woman should always have a hidden weapon," he'd told her, showing her how to secure it so it wouldn't shift while riding. They rode in companionable silence, Miguel occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing stories of cattle drives along this route. Clara found herself grateful for his easy conversation, distracting her from worries about what they might or might not find in Silver Creek. Near the creek, Miguel raised his hand, signaling a stop. "Riders ahead." Clara squinted against the sun. 3 mounted figures waited where the trail descended to the water. "Thornton's men?" she asked, her hand moving instinctively toward the Winchester secured to her saddle. Miguel's expression hardened. "Stay behind me." As they approached cautiously, Clara recognized Hatch, Thornton's foreman, flanked by 2 hired guns whose faces she recalled from the confrontation at the creek. A sick feeling settled in her stomach. This was no chance encounter. "Bit far from Blackwater," Hatch called out, his tone falsely casual. Miguel's hand hovered near his pistol. "Free country. We're passing through. Thing is," Hatch continued as if Miguel hadn't spoken, "Mr. Thornton is mighty interested in talking with Miss Reed here. Or should I say Miss Hargrove?" The confirmation of her suspicions hit Clara like a physical blow. Someone had betrayed them. Someone at Blackwater had revealed their plans. Miguel drew his pistol in one fluid motion. "Back off, Hatch. The lady's not going anywhere with you." Hatch's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Figured you'd say that." He nodded slightly. The shot came from behind them. Miguel jerked forward, a look of confusion crossing his face before he toppled from his horse. Clara screamed, reaching for him as he fell, but strong hands grabbed her reins before she could dismount. "Fourth rider," Hatch explained unnecessarily, nodding toward a man emerging from the brush behind them. "You really should have checked your back trail better." Clara fought to control her panic as she glanced down at Miguel. Blood spread across his shirt from a back wound, but she could see the shallow rise and fall of his chest. "Alive for now. He needs help," she said, forcing strength into her voice. "Let me tend to him." "He's not our concern," Hatch replied coldly. "Mr. Thornton wants to talk with you about certain accusations you've been making. You can come peacefully or not, but you're coming." Clara assessed her options with terrible clarity. 4 armed men against her single Winchester, which she couldn't reach without being shot. Miguel down. No witnesses on this isolated trail. The knife in her boot suddenly felt like her only lifeline. "I'll come," she said, affecting a defeated tone. "But please, at least drag him into the shade." "Give him a chance," Hatch considered, then nodded to one of his men. "Do it. We're not murderers." The irony of his statement wasn't lost on Clara as she watched them pull Miguel's unconscious form beneath a cottonwood tree. They left his canteen within reach but took his weapons. "If he's meant to live, he will," Hatch said philosophically. "Now let's go. Mr. Thornton's waiting." They rode north but not toward Silver Creek. By midday, Clara recognized they were circling back toward Thornton's property, approaching from an unexpected direction. Her captors maintained a watchful guard, keeping her horse between theirs, her hands free but her weapons gone, except for the knife they hadn't discovered. Thornton's ranch house loomed on a hill, ostentatious compared to Blackwater's practical buildings. White-painted and two-storied, with a broad veranda and glass windows. Luxury in this territory. As they approached, Clara glimpsed the man himself waiting on the porch, watching their arrival with evident satisfaction. "Miss Hargrove," he greeted her as Hatch helped her dismount, his fingers digging painfully into her arm. "Welcome. I've been looking forward to making your proper acquaintance for some time. Where's Miguel?" Came a voice from the side of the house. Clara turned to see a face that made her blood run cold. The betrayer, Luis, one of the newer ranch hands at Blackwater. He'd been at Dakota's table, listened to their plans, gained their trust. "Took a bullet," Hatch replied casually. "Might live, might not." Luis paled slightly but nodded, accepting his blood money from Thornton with only minimal hesitation. "You've earned this," Thornton told him. "Now get back to Blackwater. Keep me informed of Dakota's movements." As Luis rode away, Clara fixed his face in her memory. If she survived this, he would answer for his betrayal. Thornton turned his attention back to her. "We have much to discuss, my dear. Particularly these wild accusations about events in California many years ago." "Not accusations," Clara replied, forcing herself to meet his gaze steadily. "Truth." Something dangerous flickered in Thornton's eyes. "Truth is a flexible concept, especially when there's no evidence. Now, shall we continue this conversation inside? I've had a room prepared for you. Comfortable, though you'll understand if we keep it locked." As Hatch guided her firmly toward the house, Clara felt the knife shift slightly against her ankle. Dakota had taught her where to strike for maximum effect. "Only when you have no other choice," he'd warned. "But if that time comes, don't hesitate." She allowed herself to be led inside, mentally mapping exits, noting the positions of guards, calculating distances and possibilities. Whatever Thornton planned, she would not be a passive victim. The bone-handled knife was her promise of that. Small but deadly, like her determination to survive. Dakota knew something was wrong when the sun reached its zenith and Diego returned alone from the north boundary check. "Where's Luis?" he asked, noting the missing ranch hand. Diego frowned. "Thought he was helping Ernesto today." A quick check confirmed no one had seen Luis since dawn. Unease settled over Dakota like an approaching storm. He strode to the bunkhouse, searching Luis's few possessions. Nothing seemed amiss until he noticed boot prints leading from the back window toward the stables, someone leaving in secret. His instincts screaming warning, Dakota saddled his fastest horse. "Something's happened to Clara and Miguel," he told the assembled ranch hands. "Diego, ride to town. Find James Wilson. Tell him to gather men he trusts. You think Luis betrayed us?" Ernesto asked, his weathered face grim. "I think he was never truly with us," Dakota replied, securing his rifle. "He asked too many questions about our water rights, our legal papers." As Dakota prepared to ride, he reached for the small leather pouch he kept in his saddlebag. His grandmother had taught him the uses of each herb inside, remedies passed through generations of Apache healers. He rarely spoke of this knowledge, part of a heritage many white men mocked. But he never rode far without the medicine pouch. Following the western trail, Dakota pushed his horse hard, scanning the ground for signs. The tracks were clear, 2 riders outbound, matching Clara and Miguel's horses. Then hours later, 4 riders approaching from the north, followed by 5 leaving together. Near Miller's Creek, he found what he feared most, blood darkening the soil beneath a cottonwood tree. "But no body," a weak voice called out. "Dakota?" Miguel lay partially hidden in brush, several yards from the tree, having dragged himself to better cover. The front of his shirt was soaked with blood from a wound that had gone through his back and out his shoulder. Dakota dismounted in a fluid motion, kneeling beside his foreman. "Clara?" "Thornton's men," Miguel gasped. "Ambush. Took her. I couldn't—" "Save your strength," Dakota interrupted, opening his medicine pouch. He worked quickly, applying crushed herbs to slow the bleeding before binding the wound tightly. "Can you ride?" Miguel's face was gray with pain but determined. If it means finding Clara, yes. They rode double, following the tracks northward until they unexpectedly circled back toward Thornton's ranch. Dakota's jaw tightened as he understood the strategy, approaching from an unexpected direction to avoid detection. By late afternoon, they reached a rise overlooking Thornton's property. The white-painted ranch house stood on a hill, surrounded by outbuildings and corrals. Guards patrolled visibly, more men than a ranch normally required. "They're expecting trouble," Miguel observed. His voice strained from pain despite the medicine's effects. Dakota studied the layout through his spyglass. 6 men outside. More inside, probably. Too many for us alone. We're not alone. Dakota indicated movement at the base of the hill, riders approaching cautiously through the trees. James Wilson led 3 men Dakota recognized from town, including the blacksmith and his son. As dusk gathered, they convened in a sheltered ravine. James handed Dakota a folded document. "Sheriff Caldwell wouldn't come," he explained. But Martha convinced Deputy Carter to issue this, an arrest warrant for Thornton on suspicion of kidnapping. Dakota glanced at the paper, understanding its value and limitations. "This gives us legal standing, but Thornton won't surrender simply because of paper." "The deputy's riding from the east with a few men," the blacksmith added. "Said he'd give us time to get into position. He's young, but he has spine." They formulated a plan as night fell. Miguel, despite Dakota's objections, insisted on participating. "That's my blood on the ground back there," he said simply. "I aim to balance accounts." Inside Thornton's house, Clara sat in a locked bedroom, watching shadows lengthen through barred windows. They had searched her thoroughly upon arrival, but somehow overlooked the knife in her boot. She'd kept it hidden, waiting for the right moment. A key turned in the lock. Thornton entered, followed by Hatch. "I hope you found your accommodation satisfactory," Thornton said, his politeness a thin veneer over menace. "I've come to continue our discussion about your family situation." Clara stood, keeping her weight off the foot with the hidden knife. "There's nothing to discuss. You murdered my grandparents and stole their fortune." Thornton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Interesting theory. Unprovable, of course, particularly since the only witness will soon have a tragic accident while attempting to escape custody." The casual mention of her planned murder chilled Clara's blood, but she kept her expression neutral. "People know where I am. Dakota will come for me." "I'm counting on it," Thornton replied. "The Apache has been a thorn in my side for too long. When he arrives to rescue you, my men have instructions to shoot on sight. Self-defense, of course." Clara controlled her reaction, though fear for Dakota surged through her. "And when we're both dead, what then?" "Then I'll console the community over this terrible tragedy, while proceeding with my legal claim to Blackwater's water rights. With the principal opponents deceased, Judge Patterson will find it much easier to rule in my favor." Thornton moved closer. "Unless you're willing to be reasonable." "Reasonable? Sign a statement renouncing your claims about events in California. Withdraw your support of Blackwater's petition. Do this, and perhaps you can leave here alive, provided you continue east and never return." Clara measured the distance between them, calculating the moment to reach for her knife. Before she could move, a commotion erupted outside, shouting, then a single gunshot. Thornton's head snapped toward the window. "What now?" he growled, gesturing to Hatch. "Check it." As Hatch moved to the window, the distant sound of hoofbeats grew louder. Clara felt a surge of hope. Dakota had come, just as she knew he would. Thornton grabbed her arm, his fingers digging painfully. "It seems we need to accelerate our timetable," he said, drawing a pistol from his coat. "Come along, Miss Hargrove. It's time to arrange that escape attempt." The night exploded into chaos around Thornton's ranch. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as Dakota's allies created diversions at the perimeter. In the confusion, Dakota himself moved like a shadow toward the main house. The hunting knife that had belonged to his father, secured at his belt, an heirloom blade with a handle carved from elk antler, its surface worn smooth by generations of hands. Inside, Thornton dragged Clara toward the rear stairs, his pistol pressed against her ribs. "You've caused me considerable inconvenience, Miss Hargrove," he hissed, his cultured facade crumbling under pressure. Clara stumbled deliberately, buying seconds while calculating her options. The hidden knife in her boot remained her only weapon, but Thornton's grip made reaching it impossible. "Not yet. Your men can't hold them off forever," she said, hearing the gunfire intensify outside. "I don't need forever. Just long enough to ensure neither you nor that Apache leave any evidence behind." Thornton's breath was hot against her ear. Such a shame. Young woman killed during a raid by renegade Indians. So tragic. He forced her down a back hallway toward what appeared to be a study. Clara noticed his eyes darting toward a large desk. Something important there. Papers, perhaps, or evidence he needed to destroy before fleeing. Hatch burst through the door behind them. "Boss, they've broken through the north fence. Wilson and the deputy are with them," Thornton cursed. "Hold them off. I need 5 minutes. There's too many—" A crash from the front of the house cut Hatch's protest short. He drew his gun and hurried back toward the sound. Alone with Clara again, Thornton shoved her into the study and locked the door behind them. He moved quickly to the desk, keeping his pistol trained on her while pulling out a leather portfolio with his free hand. "My insurance," he murmured, more to himself than Clara. "Always keep leverage." Outside the study window, shadows moved across the grounds. Clara recognized Takoda's fluid movement among them, closing in on the house. "Just a little longer. You won't escape," she said, drawing Thornton's attention. "There are witnesses now. People who know what you did. To my family, to Miguel. Witnesses can disappear," Thornton replied coldly, stuffing papers into his coat. "As your grandparents discovered." The admission sent a chill through Clara, but also a grim satisfaction. "You just confessed to murder." Thornton's laugh held no humor. "To a dead woman walking? Hardly matters." A commotion in the hallway, shouts, a gunshot, then silence. Thornton moved behind Clara, pistol pressed to her temple as the door handle turned. Finding it locked, whoever was outside paused. "Takoda?" Clara called out, earning a painful jab from Thornton's gun. "Clara!" His voice, so calm and steady, flowed through the door like a lifeline. "Are you hurt?" "Not yet," Thornton answered before she could speak. "But that could change quickly. Back away, Blackwater, or I'll put a bullet through her head." "If she dies," Takoda replied evenly, "you won't leave this room alive." Something in his tone made Thornton's hand tremble slightly against Clara's head. In that brief moment of uncertainty, she made her move, dropping suddenly to one knee while reaching for the knife in her boot. Thornton fired, the bullet splintering the door frame where her head had been a second earlier. Clara rolled sideways, knife now in hand, as the door crashed inward under Takoda's powerful kick. What followed seemed to happen in fragments of time, each moment crystallized in Clara's memory. Thornton turning his pistol toward Takoda. Takoda drawing his father's blade in one fluid motion. The flash of ancient steel as it sailed through the air with deadly precision. Thornton's cry of pain as the knife embedded itself in his shoulder, causing his shot to go wide. Then Takoda was across the room, his momentum carrying both men crashing into the heavy desk. Thornton, despite his wound, fought with desperate strength, managing to knock Takoda's head against the corner of the desk with an audible crack. Clara scrambled forward as Thornton reached again for his fallen pistol. Without hesitation, she drove her small knife into the back of his hand, pinning it to the wooden floor. His scream echoed through the room as Takoda recovered, retrieving his father's blade from Thornton's shoulder. "For my grandparents," Clara said, her voice steady despite the violence around her. "And for everyone else you've harmed." Takoda held his knife to Thornton's throat, his eyes meeting Clara's in silent question. She gave an imperceptible shake of her head. "Not like this. Silas Thornton," came a new voice from the doorway. Deputy Carter stood there, official papers in one hand, revolver in the other. "You're under arrest for the kidnapping of Clara Reed, the attempted murder of Miguel Santos, and conspiracy against legal property owners." As the deputy recited charges, Dakota moved to Clara, his hand gentle on her arm, despite the blood trickling from a cut on his temple. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly. "No," she answered, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality that they had both survived. "You came for me." "Always," he replied simply, the single word carrying a weight of meaning that made her heart swell. James Wilson appeared behind the deputy, his face lighting with relief at the sight of Clara. "Thank God! Miguel was certain you were—" "Miguel's alive," Clara interrupted, hope surging through her. Dakota nodded. "Wounded but fighting. He insisted on coming." As Thornton was secured and led away, still clutching his bleeding hand, Clara noticed the scattered papers from his portfolio. She knelt quickly, gathering documents that made her breath catch. Financial records showing transfers from her grandparents' accounts to Thornton's, correspondence about eliminating obstacles, and most damning, a deed to Hargrove Properties with her grandfather's clearly forged signature. "Evidence," she said, handing the papers to James. "For more charges to come." Outside, the night had grown quiet as Thornton's men surrendered or fled. Clara stepped onto the porch, Dakota beside her, his father's bloodied knife now cleaned and returned to its sheath, a family legacy that had played its part in delivering justice at last. The journey to Silver Creek took place 3 days after Thornton's arrest. This time, Clara rode with Dakota beside her, Miguel recuperating at Blackwater under Ernesto's watchful care. The betrayer, Luis, had been caught trying to flee the territory and now shared a cell with his former employer, both men facing substantial charges. "Are you certain you want to do this?" Dakota asked, as Silver Creek's modest church spire appeared on the horizon. "The trunk might not still be there after all these years." Clara nodded, determination evident in her posture. "I need to know. Even if nothing remains, I need to try." The small town had changed little since Clara had last seen it as a child. The same dusty main street, the weathered buildings, the cemetery on the hill, where her parents lay in unmarked graves, victims of a fever that had swept through the region 12 years earlier, leaving Clara an orphan at 8 years old. The church pastor had changed, but church records remained. The elderly woman who served as caretaker remembered the trunk. "In the storage room all these years," she explained, leading them to a small outbuilding behind the church. "Pastor Miller always said someone would come for it eventually." The trunk sat beneath piles of hymnals and faded Sunday school materials, its leather straps cracked with age, but the lock still secure. Clara knelt before it, fingers trembling slightly as she withdrew the small key she'd kept with her locket all these years. Another piece of her past she'd never fully understood until now. The lock turned with surprising ease. Inside, the scent of cedar and memories greeted her, her mother's shawl, her father's spare boots, books and household items deemed too precious to leave behind when they fled California. Beneath these lay a false bottom, just as Clara had vaguely remembered. Her father had shown her once, explaining that important papers were kept there. Now she understood what those papers were: letters, deeds, banking documents, and most critically, a journal in her father's neat handwriting detailing his suspicions about Thornton's involvement in the deaths of Clara's grandparents, including overheard conversations and financial discrepancies he'd discovered while working as the family's business manager before marrying Clara's mother. "He knew," Clara whispered, turning pages with reverent care. "He collected evidence, waiting for the right time to bring it forward. Then they were killed, and he fled with me to protect us both." Dakota sat beside her, his presence a steady comfort as she absorbed this revelation. "Your father was a brave man. He was preparing to contact authorities when the fever took them both," Clara continued, piecing together the story from journal entries. "He never got the chance to seek justice, until now," Dakota reminded her gently. "Through you." Among the papers lay a small, carefully wrapped package. Inside was a photograph, remarkably preserved, showing her grandparents standing proudly behind her parents on their wedding day. 4 faces smiling at a future they couldn't imagine. unaware of the treachery that would soon destroy them. Clara traced her mother's features, seeing her own eyes and chin reflected back. "I'd forgotten what they looked like," she admitted, tears threatening. "So many years trying to survive, I lost even their faces." Dakota's arm slipped around her shoulders, a rare public display of affection. Clara leaned into his strength, allowing herself this moment of vulnerability before carefully repacking the most important items to take back to redemption. The following weeks brought rapid changes. Judge Patterson, faced with overwhelming evidence and community pressure, ruled decisively in Dakota's favor regarding Blackwater's boundaries and water rights. The torn deed was officially validated, its legitimacy no longer in question. Thornton faced multiple charges: kidnapping, attempted murder, and as evidence from Clara's father's journal was verified, conspiracy and accessory to the murders of William and Catherine Hargrove. His assets were frozen pending investigation, much of his wealth likely to be restored to Clara as the rightful heir. Sheriff Caldwell resigned in disgrace when his collusion with Thornton came to light. Deputy Carter was appointed interim sheriff, bringing a new sense of justice to redemption. In Blackwater's main house, Clara carefully placed the restored family photograph on the mantel, the first personal touch she'd added to Dakota's austere home. He watched her from the doorway, his expression softening in a way only she ever witnessed. "It belongs there," he said simply. Clara turned to him, emotion welling. "I never thought I'd find answers. Or justice, or..." She hesitated, then finished softly, "or home." "Home is more than land," Dakota replied, moving to stand before her. His hand reached up to touch her cheek in a gesture that had become familiar in recent days. "It's people, connection, family," Clara added, her gaze meeting his. In the weeks since Thornton's arrest, something had shifted between them, the unspoken feelings now finding expression in small touches, lingering glances, and quiet moments like this one. "The town is talking," Dakota said, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "About the Apache and the heiress," Clara smiled. "Let them talk. You could have a different life now," he continued more seriously. "Your inheritance, your true name restored. You could go anywhere, be anyone." "I already am who I want to be," she replied without hesitation. "Clara Reed or Clara Hargrove, neither matters as much as who I've become here. With you." The photograph watched over them as Dakota finally bridged the distance between them, his lips finding hers in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey. Outside, ranch hands averted their eyes with knowing smiles as they passed the window, while inside, Clara and Dakota sealed a promise that had begun the moment a starving orphan girl had knocked on his door, and he couldn't stop staring into her eyes. The early spring sunrise painted Blackwater Ranch in hues of gold and promise. 6 months had passed since Thornton's arrest, and the land had transformed as dramatically as the lives of those who called it home. Clara stood on the porch, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill. From this vantage point, she could see the new irrigation channels that carried water from the spring creek to formerly barren fields. The winter rains had finally come, breaking the drought and bringing new life to the territory. "You should be resting," came Dakota's voice behind her, warm with concern. Clara smiled, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly, still small enough to be hidden by loose dresses, but growing steadily with their child. "The baby and I needed fresh air." Dakota joined her at the railing, his hand covering hers, in a gesture that had become natural between them. Marriage had softened some of his sharp edges, though he remained the same strong, decisive man who had first opened his door to a starving orphan girl. "Miguel says the north pasture fence is complete," he said. "The new hands are working out well." The ranch had expanded, both in size and prosperity. Clara's inheritance from the Hargrove estate, partially restored through legal proceedings against Thornton, had allowed them to purchase adjacent land, hire additional workers, and implement improvements that would sustain Blackwater for generations. but more significant than the physical changes were the social ones. The ranch had become a gathering place for both white settlers and Apache families, a bridge between worlds that reflected the marriage at its center. "Martha's bringing the children from town next week," Clara reminded him. "They're excited to see the new foals." The school visits had been her idea, bringing Redemption's children to experience ranch life and learn about Apache traditions from Dakota's extended family members. "Education, breaking down barriers that force never could. I have something to show you," Dakota said, taking her hand. "It's finished." He led her to the workshop behind the main house, his private space where he retreated to think and create. Inside, illuminated by morning light streaming through the window, stood his labor of the past months. A cradle, hand-carved from cedar wood. Clara gasped softly, moving forward to trace the intricate designs etched into the wood. Apache symbols of protection and blessing flowed seamlessly into classic Western patterns, the two traditions blending into something uniquely beautiful, much like their union. "It's perfect," she whispered, emotion catching in her throat. Dakota's fingers joined hers on the smooth wood. "My father made one for me," he explained, "and his father before him. It's tradition. Our child will know both sides of their heritage," Clara said with certainty. "The strength of the Apache and the resilience of the Hargroves, and the compassion of their mother," Dakota added, his usually stoic expression warming as he looked at her. The sound of approaching horses drew them outside. James Wilson rode in, accompanied by the new sheriff and a man in a business suit whom Clara recognized as her lawyer from Sacramento. "Good news," James called as they dismounted. "Final verdict came through. Thornton's been sentenced to 20 years for his role in your grandparents' deaths." Clara nodded, satisfaction rather than joy flowing through her. Justice had been served, though no punishment could truly compensate for the lives lost and years stolen. "There's more," the lawyer added, producing documents from his satchel. "The court has officially restored your full inheritance. The Hargrove estate is yours completely, Mrs. Blackwater." Clara accepted the papers with a smile at the name that still felt new and precious. "Thank you for your work, Mr. Bennett. I have instructions for how the assets should be distributed." Later, after their visitors had departed, Clara and Dakota walked to the hilltop overlooking the ranch. Below them, Blackwater spread in all directions, fields greening with spring crops, cattle grazing in lush pastures, the main house standing solid and welcoming. "I've been thinking," Clara said, leaning against Dakota's steady shoulder. "About the Hargrove fortune, your inheritance," he corrected gently. Dakota had been adamant that her family's wealth remain in her name, separate from the ranch finances. "I want to establish a foundation," she continued, "for orphaned children, a place where they can find safety, education, and family." Dakota's arm tightened around her, "using your past to build a better future for others." "The way you did for me," Clara replied softly, as the sun climbed higher. They made their way back toward the house, where Ernesto was preparing a celebration meal. Miguel, now fully recovered and promoted to foreman, supervised new hands unloading supplies. Martha Wilson and her son would arrive later, along with others from town who had become part of their extended family circle. In the workshop, the carved cradle awaited its precious occupant, a symbol of hope and continuity. On the mantel, Clara's family photograph stood as a reminder of the past that had shaped her, and all around, Blackwater Ranch flourished as testament to what could be built when two wounded souls found healing in each other. That evening, as friends gathered around their table and laughter filled the once silent house, Clara caught Dakota's gaze across the room. In his eyes, she saw the same wonder she felt, that hunger and loss had somehow led to such abundance. The starving orphan girl and the Alpha Apache had found in each other not just survival, but a legacy that would endure long after their own story became legend in the territory. A tale of courage, justice, and a love strong enough to bridge worlds.